Hello. Bonjour. Welcome. Come on in to today's workshop on telling your organization's story to connect, inform, and amplify. I'm Andrea Piche. My pronouns are she and her, and I am pleased to be your host today. Now, before I go too far, I want to ensure that everyone is accessing this session in their preferred language of English or French. We're pleased to offer French simultaneous interpretation by Karen Rosbach Communications for this session. If you wish to hear the voice of the interpreter, please select French from the interpretation menu at the bottom of your screen. And if you don't see it there, you might see a little circle with 3 dots and the word more underneath. Just click on that button and you'll see the interpretation menu from there. This workshop is being offered by Healthcare Excellence Canada in partnership with the Alliance for Healthier Communities. We developed this workshop in response to what we've been hearing from folks across the country, particularly folks providing services in health and social care and community organizations. And what we've heard is that your work makes a difference and you want to reach more people and you want to attract more volunteers. And you want leadership or a board or your advisory groups or your patient and family care partners to understand the importance and impact of what you're doing. We've also heard that you need funders to see and support what's possible based on your work, and that your communication work is something that you often do alone or off the side of your desk. And so we're pleased to host you today for a virtual workshop designed to help you effectively communicate your work and its impact. If you need any support at any time during this webinar, you can reach out to tech support using the chat feature. Now, we also invite you to share your questions and comments at any point using the chat box in either English or French. And we encourage all of you to respond to each other's comments and answer each other's questions as well. If we have time, and I'm hopeful that we will, we would like to invite our facilitator to respond to your questions at the end of the workshop. And the responses to those questions, including any that come up that we don't have time for today, will be included in our written Q&A that we'll share after the webinar. The session's being recorded, and a link to the recording will be available in the coming weeks. I would like to start by acknowledging that we are meeting on land that has been inhabited by Indigenous peoples since the beginning. In particular, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm joining you from Grimsby, Ontario, which is the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and Ojibwe Chippewa peoples covered by the Upper Canada Treaties. If you haven't already, I invite you to say hello in the chat and share the name of the ancestral lands that you're joining from. In support of my personal journey of truth and reconciliation, I was recently gifted and read the late Maurice Sinclair's memoir titled Who We Are. The book is a beautiful tapestry of stories that weaves together some of his life's lessons as a guide for how to reconcile and move into a future that's based on truth and mutual respect. The book, for me, was a powerful reminder of the importance of storytelling to preserve cultural heritage. And what I really appreciated so much is the way that his stories illustrated the power of grace and humility. And so as you participate in this workshop, I invite you to reflect with grace and humility about what's possible when you effectively and safely communicate the impact of the important work you're doing. It's my pleasure to introduce our facilitator from the Alliance for Healthier Communities, Jason Rail. Jason is a writer, editor, community health advocate, and health communications specialist based in the Niagara region. Jason has extensive experience in the art of storytelling, and I can wholeheartedly attest that he is passionate about helping others harness the power of narratives. Welcome, Jason.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Andrea. I'm first of all want to say I'm so pleased to be here with all of you today. Thank you for taking the time, not just an hour, not just a lunch break, but taking this hour and a half to devote to storytelling and to devote to spreading the messages about your work. Not only do I think that work is vital, I've devoted my career to sharing messages that I think help to change policy, which then in turn help to change lives. And so I don't want to waste too much time on myself here. I do want to say, though, I'm very appreciative to the Alliance for Healthier Communities, which is where I work as my day job as the public and media relations specialist there. I've been there for 9 years. I'm very grateful to the Alliance for allowing me to work with Healthcare Excellence Canada, who kind of found me last year at the Alliance conference when I was presenting on media relations, and said, "Hey, we've got some work to do around storytelling nationally. Can you support us in that work?" It's been really interesting working with folks on a national level. I don't need to say to anyone here that what knits us together as a country right now is more important than ever before. And one of the things I believe that knits us together are our stories, and specifically our stories about how we support each other, about how we build our communities, about how we build our health and our social systems. And so that's why we're here today. And I think that's, of utmost importance right now. It will be utmost importance in 20 years from now. So I think there's a real solidity to what we're doing here and importance to what we're doing here. I want to situate myself on the land as well. I, like Andrea, not that far from Andrea, in fact, just down the highway in St. Catharines, Ontario, traditional lands of the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, the Huron-Wendat, covered by the Upper Canada Treaties, and the Dish with One Spoon and Wampum Belt agreements. I want to highlight those agreements because those agreements were made hundreds of years ago, but are still in effect today, and were meant to engender peace between distinct peoples, but also stewardship for these lands which I'm grateful to be on, these lands which I wouldn't be on without the stories, the storytelling, and the impacts from those stories that happened generations upon generations before my family landed in Mi'kmaq territory in Quebec a few centuries ago. So, situating myself on that land and our responsibility both to each other and to our stories and each other's stories, I come at you with 20 years of experience from professional spaces, mostly colonized Western spaces in journalism and in healthcare communications, including a stint at a newspaper for about a decade and now working in healthcare communications for about the same, so sort of half and half. I have a lifelong obsession with language. I love language in all its forms, and talking about it, learning about it. I'm currently trying to learn a couple of second and third languages myself, but it's central to my life. I'm also informed by a recent acute care experience of my own and moving through the cancer care system in Ontario. So that informs my experiences as well as my training. And I just completed it on the weekend, in fact, as a mediator. I'll hopefully be practicing that and then in the next couple of years. So that's enough about me. That's where I'm coming at you from in terms of storytelling, communications, and who I am. So next slide, please. Okay, a little bit more about what we're going to talk about today. And you can see here the agenda. I won't read it off for you, but we're going to start by talking a little bit about what underpins storytelling, and what you should kind of be thinking about before you even embark on storytelling. But I also want to tell you what today's session is not about. And that's just in case you're kind of wandering along through this and you're not as familiar with story as some others, and you're going like, well, how come he's not talking about this? First of all, today is not a comms webinar, and I want to make that distinct here because sometimes storytelling and communications can be used as placeholders for each other, and they're really quite distinct things. Storytelling can be a strategy or a tactic used within a communications plan, but it absolutely does not replace what a communications plan does. So today is not a communications webinar. Today is also not a key messages webinar, even though we're going to touch on key messages and the roles that they play in storytelling. But today, again, isn't a key messages webinar. I could do a separate whole workshop on that. It's also not a media relations seminar. So we're going to touch on media relations, but again, that could be a whole workshop on its own and has a lot of moving parts to it. And lastly, today is not a writing workshop. And I want to stress that because I think when we talk about storytelling, people often think about writing, and they may think that I'm here to teach writing. Again, more than a workshop, if I was going to show people effective writing techniques for storytelling, that's probably several workshops on its own. So that's what we're not here to talk about today. What we are here to talk about today is a certain kind of strategic storytelling, how to plan for it, how to take the resources you have and to make it happen, and how to do it most effectively to move messages that can change minds and hearts so that you can impact policy. So, we're here for a really specific purpose around storytelling, which is how it can impact your work and how you can make it work for you based on what you have at your fingertips, i.e., experiences and people's testimonials and people's experiences and various understandings of aging in place and other types of stories as well. I've been working with the Aging in Place Collaborative for a little while now over the last few months, so my mind's been in that space. But really, we're going to unpack things today. If you're telling a health story, if you're telling a social services story, if you're telling any story where you're trying to impact on on public policy, that's where we're looking. So we'll jump right into it. Next slide, please. The preamble to the storytelling steps. Okay, so what we're going to get into here, next slide, please, is what a story is, what it can do. Um, when artists make art, they're generally speaking, they're engaged in storytelling. And across the board, if people are sitting around a campfire and they're telling stories, they're also engaged in storytelling. If people are practicing a religion together, chances are they're engaged in storytelling. When a parliament meets, they're engaged in a form of storytelling, even though a layperson may not be able to quickly identify that. In other words, storytelling surrounds us at all times. It is, as I say here, a way of understanding the world, each other, and ourselves. And it has been like that pretty much since the dawn of recorded human history, that we've used stories, we've used narratives, we've used characters, settings, and plot as a way of saying this is what happened. This is the way I understand what just happened. This is the way I understand what I saw in the sky. This is the way I understand what I saw when I was out fishing on my boat. This is the way I understand the world. It's also used, story, as a way of demonstrating how you can resolve conflict, ways of addressing an issue. In other words, it's a way of presenting solutions. It's a way of also presenting uh, problems in such a way that an audience sees, oh, there's a solution needed here. We have to address this problem. So, in other words, storytelling is also used to convey when there's a need amongst a group of people for action. It's a mode of conveyance as well, and it's a mode of preservation for personal, familial, societal, cultural, religious histories and stories. It's how we preserve who we are, both in groups and as individuals. You think about the family photo album, but then you could also think about the shared yearbook for the team club or the school, for the religious organization, for the cultural group. That's frequently a way that things get passed along. Of course, I don't want to, and we'll lean on this a little bit later when we talk about story safety. I don't want to just talk about westernized ways of telling story here. I know there's many ways of telling stories that are not rooted in colonial traditions of writing stories down. So there's oral traditions, there's musical traditions, there's theatrical traditions of storytelling, and there's many different ways. As many people as there are on Earth, there are ways to tell stories. They're also, of course, an important form of entertainment and pleasure for us as human beings. We like to tell stories to each other. If you think about yourself at the end of the day with your family, with your friends, why you tell stories to each other, it's not always just to share information. Sometimes it's just because it's fun. We like to tell stories to each other because it makes us feel good. It makes us feel connected to each other. And lastly, as a teaching tool, of course, and here, even when we're teaching something as abstract as mathematics, everyone knows that sometimes word problems are used. Why? Because that suddenly you have a story attached to those numbers and it becomes different or easier to understand what is an abstract concept when you have words which represent a human story right next to that. So those are some of the things that story can be used for. Of course, there's that great quote there, tell me a fact and I'll learn, tell me a truth, I'll believe, but tell me a story, it'll be in my heart forever. We're concerned with this. This is not just a nice quote to have there. We're concerned with this because we want our messages to linger. We want them to stick in policymakers' brains. We want decision makers to be considering them when they're sitting down to draft new policy, when they're making laws that govern the areas that we work in. Next slide, please. Okay, so what is a story? What can it do? A good story will always have a longer shelf life in people's minds and hearts than a piece of data by itself. So it'll last longer. It'll resonate with people. They'll be in a meeting 6 months or a year later and they'll go, oh, I just remembered what somebody told me about that innovation. And if you've attached a story to that innovation, they're going to remember, oh, it had a real profound result for this person. And so just the neuroscience of story is such that if you attach your evidence to a story, it lasts longer, physically lasts longer in someone's brain. It resonates longer. And so that's one of the important key advantages to a story. Now, what happens when we tell good stories? Well, and I'm getting you thinking here, lots of good things can happen. Recruitment, whether it's staff or volunteers, board members, community engagement, people know who you are, they're talking about your work. Partnerships, so people that you hadn't thought about working with are suddenly looking you up. Why? Because they saw a story and they were really intrigued by the work you're doing and the impacts it's having. Funding, of course, goes without saying. Funders, whether they're governments or nonprofit organizations, the United Way, etc., they want to see stories because that's how they understand impact. You're showing the impact, not just through data, not just through bar graphs, not just through bottom lines of financials, but through actually like how things are impacting people's lives. Well, how does that surface? It surfaces through story. It surfaces through people's quotes. It surfaces through the basic construction. I used to be facing this problem, but then this intervention was made. And so now things are like this. And so we'll get into the story structure more in depth in a minute, but I wanted to give you a sense of, when you tell a story like that, it can have real impacts. It can lead to policy change. What's the ... here for? It's because stories can lead to a lot of things that we don't even consider. It can certainly lead to saving lives. We saw during the pandemic, I'll use one example here before we jump to the next slide. We saw in Ontario during the pandemic that storytelling done around communities and what communities were doing to support themselves, going door to door, checking in on people, doing isolation checks, that telling stories about that then helped inform the kinds of stories that were being told about rolling out vaccines, which then in turn informed vaccination policy, which then informed how things were being funded, not just at the local, provincial level, but also at the national level. We ended up having some impact on Public Health Agency of Canada and how they were rolling out vaccine confidence. For instance, I'll give you an example of how that really changed things. We went from having a discussion about vaccine hesitancy initially, which was pinned on individuals, to having more of a discussion about vaccine confidence and how it was actually up to the system to show people this is why this is safe for you. Here's why you can trust in what's coming. So that was a good example, I think, of how a story can help save the day. A story can really change things in real life, is that we ended up with a much different vaccination response than we would have without the storytelling. Next slide, please. Okay, now we're going to jump right into what we've threaded through as a case study example throughout our workshop today, which is social prescribing in Canada. For those of you that aren't familiar with social prescribing yet, social prescribing is an innovation that was introduced in Canada in 2018. It was introduced through the organization that I work with, the Alliance for Healthier Communities, as a pilot project. And at that point, social prescribing as a concept, as an intervention, i.e., a person goes to a clinician or someone working in a clinical type space and is given a prescription, not for a drug or for a medical intervention like a test, but is instead given a prescription for a social intervention, such as joining a walking group or seeing people for a shared meal once a week, or joining a group that goes fishing once a month, or these sorts of activity, going to a museum or an art gallery together. These are sorts of the prescriptions that we were introducing, and introducing not only that, but a whole apparatus, a system, an intervention at the social medical level that would accompany this to really start joining up two sides, i.e., the social determinants of health, the non-clinical, non-medical, with the medical, really getting those two sides talking to each other in a more deliberate, in a more conscious way than they had before through the concept of social prescribing. So, for myself as a communications person, I was working with a program lead and working with our director at the time at the Alliance for Healthier Communities, and our goal was to take this concept of social prescribing, which was virtually unknown in Canada. There were some people that would go, "Oh, I think I understand what that means," just by sort of parsing out the words. But by and large, the concept wasn't known here as it is in some other jurisdictions, such as the UK. So our real challenge at first was no one knows what this thing is. Virtual unknown in Canada. How can we get this out into the world in such a way that people will understand it better? So we started by breaking it down into its components. Well, what is it? And as I just described, we kind of broke it down into plain language what it is, because even the concept social prescribing is itself a sort of form of clinical jargon. What do you mean social? What do you mean prescribing? And certainly, what do they mean together? So we started unpacking it a bit. We came up with our goals of our early storytelling, which was to educate and inform not just the public, but also policymakers about what this thing was, why it mattered, and what it could do. And then we also identified, and what I like to call this, identifying the bad guy, or the problem, or the obstacle in the story, the thing that will cause the tension, which we identified to be isolation and loneliness. Um, we knew that we wanted to introduce social prescribing as a better way to access health and social supports that were non-clinical, but we also knew that saying that to the public was not exactly going to get everybody excited about the story. But we knew from reading at the time that people were really interested in the concepts of isolation, loneliness, the impact that this was having on people's health. And we knew that if we could position social prescribing as a response, as a solution to isolation and loneliness, that we had the makings of a good story. Okay, so where did we take it from there? Well, the important thing to start with was to focus on uh, what our goals were and who our audience was. So next slide, please. Okay, so what we did to start with was we recognized that we needed to pull people in. And so the way to pull people in was to say, hey, do you know what a social prescription is? Really to pose the question and then to offer an answer and say, well, this is a different way of engaging with the health system. What if you went to your doctor and you could get a prescription for karaoke or for dance lessons, or for community gardening, for bingo? And we put together, what was essentially a very clickbaity, especially for healthcare, type of press release that was designed to get the media's attention. Really designed. And it wasn't that everybody, doing social prescribing was going to be out there prescribing bingo, but we thought that was a really compelling story. Or a museum visit. Again, a very compelling concept. Like, imagine you could visit a doctor and they would give you a prescription for one of these non-clinical interventions. How cool is that, right? And that was enough. The kind of how cool is that vibe was enough to sort of get the media interested. This was our hook, essentially. Now, of course, we had evidence from the UK. We didn't have any of our own evidence at the time. We had evidence from the UK, and we had this hypothesis that by connecting the clinical and the non-clinical together, that people were going to have better experiences and better outcomes in the healthcare system. And so that was kind of the hypothesis we were running from. But we didn't expect that the media or that anyone would necessarily jump on that as a concept, that people would be interested in the concept of connecting the non-clinical and the clinical better in a healthcare setting for better experiences. Again, it's jargon, it's within the health system. How could we take that story and make it vital to everyone? Well, what if you could get a prescription for something that's non-clinical? And suddenly that got people's imaginations going. And again, there's one thing I'd impress on you in the preamble here. It's that we do, as storytellers, need to focus on capturing people's imaginations, getting them to think, whether it's a piece of data that's really compelling, but we're like, okay, no one's going to understand what this means, or whether it's a story from someone's life where it's just one person's story, but that if people understood the intervention being made and it was scaled up, that it could make a much bigger difference. We have to capture someone's imagination. We have to capture them and make them think like, well, what if that was available to me? Or what if that was available in my community? Or, wow, that's a good idea. I hadn't thought of that way of addressing that problem. So capturing someone's imagination is the first step. That's why it's so important to have that hook. Next slide, please. Okay, so as I alluded to, the first things we had to think about when we were heading out to capture people's minds and hearts when it came to social prescribing were the goals and the audiences. So even before key messages, because people often want to jump to tactics. They say like, well, we're going to do something on Twitter. We're going to send a press release. We're going to do this. Those are all tactics. And in comm speak, you don't want to start with a tactic. You want to start with a goal. You want to start with something that's overarching and connected to your objectives. What are your objectives? I tell people to go to your strategic plans. Chances are, if you have a strategic plan, and most organizations do, you're going to know what your objectives are just based out of that plan. Okay, so once you know what your strategic objectives are, then you can start connecting those up to your storytelling and say, okay, why are we telling a story? Why do we need to tell a story? And the answer will be there in your strategic objectives. Now, why you tell a specific story from your work, I'll get into that as it comes. That has a lot more to do with the serendipity of the thing. So why you're telling a specific story, it's often because, well, someone spoke up. Someone from your clients or from your volunteer base or from your organization said, hey, I heard this last week. And so it does happen kind of organically. But then you want to know the why of why you're telling it. So the why of why you're telling it is different from the why of why you're telling a specific story. You're telling a specific story because you ended up with those story materials. You went out into the world, you went out into your work, you talked to your staff, your volunteer base, and you said, okay, what have you got? Who's heard some successes lately? So that's why you're telling that specific story. But why you're telling the story in the more global sense, that's got to come from your strategic objectives. And so you should have a deliberate connection between your storytelling and your strategic objectives. Who are you trying to reach? Well, that depends on what kind of action you need the person to take. And again, that comes back to your goal, and that's why goal is there first. Once you know what your goal is, then you can know who needs to take action for you to reach that goal and take that objective. So, next slide, please. How does this pan out in the real world? Well, this is how it panned out when it came to social prescribing. Our goals were that we wanted to explain what social prescribing was in a really, really broken down, simple way that even an elementary school student could kind of understand it. We wanted to get people interested to know more. So we wanted to create some demand. Not so much, people asking for social prescribing itself, although that did happen quite quickly. We wanted people to be asking us, hey, tell me more about this. How could we do this at our organization? And we wanted to interest, of course, policymakers and funders in what we were doing because we see it as a systemic response to people's non-clinical elements of their health not being addressed within the health and social system. So we wanted to make that case to policymakers and governments, funders, and say, listen, you need to do more of this. You need to fund the apparatus to do this because ultimately it's going to save you money and it's going to help connect people better to the resources that are already out there. So we had a pretty clear mind then of who we were trying to reach, at least initially. We wanted community-minded influencers. We were going for a much broader audience, as you might expect with a new project, that we were trying to create awareness. But we were really specific. So we went after folks that we knew were writing about loneliness. We went after researchers we knew that were working on social isolation and its connection to health. And we went after decision makers that we knew were committed to the idea that healthcare needed to be more than just whether or not you could get a doctor's appointment at your primary care provider, within 6 or 7 days. So we needed somebody with more of a holistic. We needed folks that already had a more holistic view of health. So with all of those things in hand, we started developing some story structure. So we'll move into the next slide. So step 2, story structure. I know it seems a little fast that we're jumping into story structure, but I will explain as we go why that's the case. Next slide, please. So part of the reason why we jump into story structure initially is that, and I know I mentioned before that there's as many different, diverse storytelling techniques as there are human beings on the planet. And I really do firmly believe that. There's so many different ways to tell story, but there are still common elements. for something to kind of hold as a story, to be a container that is a story that of holding the basic things that a story does. These are some of the common elements. And early on, when you're developing a story, especially when you're, as we were with social prescribing back in 2018, when you're developing what I call your master story, or your the story from which other stories will flow, if you will. When you're developing that, you really do need to think about these various concepts. You need to think about the overarching, because there's going to be smaller stories that come along the way, but they are going to come back to your lead narrative, if you will. And so it's important to think about these things at the beginning, the structure and the sequence of the story. So stories have a beginning, a middle, and the end. And now some people will say, yeah, but sometimes they start like right in the middle of the action. Sure, that's true. And that's called in medias res, or starting in the middle of the action. And even in a story where you start in the middle of the action, or you may even start at the climax, it's a common Hollywood technique these days to use, the lead moment of the story right at the beginning to tease. Even if you start there, the story still has a beginning, in the middle of and an end. So even if part of the storytelling technique has been to mix them up, they're still there. They still exist. Time and the passage of time tends to be a key component of story. Characters, main and secondary. Themes, morals, and lessons. Setting. So stories tend to happen someplace, even if they happen in no place. That tends to be considered a place these days in storytelling. Plot devices. So that's flashbacks, story, foreshadowing, those sorts of techniques. A narrative voice, so a narrator or sub-narrators. Cultural and historical significance and context. That's where, that's where bias can hang out often, and that's where we do need to be conscious, especially when we're telling other people's stories, and we'll get into that a bit more in a bit. Engagement techniques. So that's your visuals, and if there's a song in the middle of the story. Obviously musicals engage in this sort of techniques to tell stories in a much more rich way. When you're moving from dialogue and someone suddenly breaks into song, that's an engagement technique to sort of get you deeper into the story. Oral and written traditions, of course, create very different techniques and traditions across stories, but they do have a lot of these same elements. Oftentimes with oral and written, what I'll tell people is and it ends up with different emphasis. You can't put the same kind of emphasis on, um, you know, sort of descriptions, but you can put a lot more emphasis on, for instance, engagement techniques, where you can actually break into song if you're telling a story live, versus a written form. Allegory and symbolism, and then the values that underpin those things. So those are just kind of like, that's even going beyond themes and morals and lessons. Themes and morals and lessons are more what you're overtly saying. This story means this. Allegory and symbolism is the sort of the stuff that hangs in the background that you're not saying overtly, but is the stuff being alluded to, the stuff that's, for instance, just there in the person's voice speaking the story, and it goes without being said so much in the words themselves. So those are some of the common elements to a story structure. Next slide, please. Okay, so we've taken some of those story elements of the structure, and now we're hanging them, or taking some of those elements of the story, and now we're hanging them on a structure. And the thing I want to impress here is this is a model for story, and this is by no means the only model for story. It's just a common model for story, particularly crossing cultures. Is you will often see this structure. It doesn't mean you'll see it identically. Sometimes, like I said before, you'll see it out of order. You will see a climax presented early on, and then people will backtrack and show you, well, here's how we ended up here. But by and large, this is how it works. And what you see there along the arc is the rising action. So we started an introduction. The characters are laid out. The setting is made clear. Perhaps the time is also laid out, and then some of the context. Then you get the complication, and the complication really is the bad guy, or the bad thing that happens, the challenge, the barrier. In this case of social prescribing, you'd be talking about isolation, loneliness. But I'm going to unpack that example fully in a minute. Then you get the middle, you get the action, you get the back and forth. So you get the characters who are facing the struggle or the barrier or the bad guy, they're having action in that middle. They're struggling. They're maybe making some progress ahead. They're maybe getting set back a bit. And then you've got kind of a climax. Something happens. Um, Somebody gets a service they need. Somebody has an aha moment as a client or even as a volunteer and goes, things were bad. I was isolated. My spouse had passed away. I hadn't seen any people, in months. And somebody knocked on my door and said, "Hey, have you considered this?" Or I was visiting with my doctor and they said, "Have you considered this a social prescription for this group? Have you considered this bereavement group?" And then suddenly things had changed. And that's where you get the denouement. And the denouement is kind of what's called the falling action in a story. And that's where in a healthcare or social services story that you can really have your lessons, your morals, you can have a bit of your research and say, listen, this impact this had on this individual person's story, just so you know, it's having these kinds of impacts across our system or could be. And so that's really where you've got your research details. It's where you've got your supporting quotes from researchers, etc. And you've also got kind of your follow up on what happened to that person in that story and what's their life been like now based on the intervention of the hero um, uh, the intervention that was being made against the barrier or the complicating factor. So next slide, please. Okay, we'll unpack story structure a little bit deeper here. Um, I've already kind of gone through some of these things a little bit. Uh, Secondary complications, it's important to remember here. So we mentioned with social prescribing, loneliness and isolation are kind of the big primary complications. But what could some secondary complications be? Well, secondary complications could be it's hard for people to access their primary care provider. It's hard for them to get an appointment. Maybe it's hard for them to travel to their primary care provider. Maybe when they get to their primary care provider, they don't have a lot of time to address more than one issue, or they don't have a lot of time to address non-medical issues. And so those things just aren't happening at that level. So you've got all these sort of like sub problems underneath the big problem that are sort of standing in the way of the person being able to address it. So it is important to lay those out in a story. I always tell people when they're writing health and social stories, though, is that you don't want to spend too much time outlining the problem. And the reason for that is that usually when you're telling a health or social story, your audiences are well aware there are problems. And you do not want to focus too much on the problem area because you don't want to be crowding out your hero, i.e., the solution, by just focusing so much on the problem that the person just goes, "Oh, I'm overwhelmed here. It can't even continue with the story." And so you do want to be clearly articulate about the problem. You want to make sure it's there in the story very clearly, but you don't want to spend a ton of time on it in a health and social story. You want to get to the hero. You want the hero to be there and present. Next slide, please. Okay, again, went over climax a little bit, but that falling action denouement, that really is where you want to explain, you know, what impact that your innovation has had on the story, and you want to make sure that you're being true to your original characters here. You don't want to say, okay, you've seen our example, you've seen the intervention, and then just jump right into hard research and data. You want to make sure that you're threading in that human element throughout the falling action as well. Now I've got coda moral here at the end. That's, if you are thinking about key messages in storytelling, and there's a reason why you won't see a lot of talk here about key messages in this workshop today, is because when I have my storytelling hat on, I'm not foregrounding a key message. And there's a reason for that. And the reason for that is whether it's a journalist who's reading my press release, or whether it's a person out there in the public coming and reading my social feed of my organization, or maybe my newsletter or my website. People can smell when key messages have been forced into a story. And what does that feel like? What does a key message forced into a story feel like? Well, it feels like advertising. And what does advertising feel like? It feels like fake. And what does fake feel like? Fake feels like I'm swiping past this or I'm scrolling down. I'm not going to stop on something that's inauthentic. And you might not think that applies to you And oftentimes in my work, I'll run into folks still and I'll feel that feeling sometimes. And I'll think, well, this work is important. I don't care if somebody wants to skip past the key message. They should just see this work as important. Well, I've got news for everyone. Like, we are all bound to this sort of what I call the rules of storytelling and the rules of story uh, accepting, or story discerning, story reading, story consuming. And that's to say, is we all do this every day. We have thousands of stories coming at us every hour of every day from lots of different sources. We have to have ways of sorting through them. So one of the ways that our brain sorts through stories is it won't linger as long on a story it doesn't think is authentic. And so if really shoving the key message, especially in the first paragraph of a story or something like that, we are possibly going to alienate our audience right off the bat, because they're like, oh, okay, I can see they have an agenda. They're pushing something here, Even if what we're pushing is right, even if it's grounded in evidence, we need to be careful we're not being too pushy. But the right place in a good story for a brilliant key message is what we call in journalism the kicker, is the coda or the moral at the very end of the story. You can leave people with a key message there, and they're kind of expecting it. By then they may have reached the same conclusion that you're reaching as well. And so it'll feel like a moment of consensus with the audience. And so it could be very powerful at the end of the story. But if you try to thread key messages in earlier than that, you do risk alienating an audience that will be on its guard for inauthenticity these days. Okay, next slide, please. I'm going to unpack an example now of story structure. And I love this example, but I want to offer the caveat of this example. And certainly if there's anyone on the session today from the social prescribing world, they'll even possibly be familiar with this example. This was what happens when everything goes not just right, but perfectly. And so the story of this is simply that we had put out that initial press release, and we started getting some good attention. And I won't lie, the bingo thing was key. Then we found out, that one of our health centers was working with the Royal Ontario Museum, and that they wanted to have a joint press conference with us. So that was great news. But myself and the program lead and Dr. Kate Mulligan, who was the director of communications at the time at the Alliance, identified a big opportunity. And we're like, this story could go big. And we had an inkling that it could go big. And so we formulated a press release around this that really tried to do, and sometimes you do this when you do a press release, is that you'll try to lay out the story as you're hoping the media themselves will tell it. It's kind of, I call it the wish list method. It's like, well, if they tell the story exactly the way we want, it'll look something like this. And then you write a press release that kind of reflects that. It itself reads like a news story. And then that goes out to the press, and you just hope that they don't drop too many of the elements that you're hoping for. And in this case, they didn't drop any of the elements. If anything, they added elements that we were, pleasantly surprised by. So the introduction here: doctors may be used to prescribing traditional medicine and treatments, but in a new pilot program, they have the option to prescribe social prescriptions. Now, obviously, I could not have hoped for anything better than this, because this was a definition of what the thing is. And because we were in the game of trying to create awareness back in 2018, 2019, this was an absolute, this was a bullseye, essentially. Next, the characters in the story. So the voices in the story included, of course, the Royal Ontario Museum in Toronto, Safia Ahmed, the local community health leader who was executive at the community health center that was working with the Royal Ontario Museum on prescribing visits to that museum to individuals and families. The refugee participant. So there's an actual client who would receive social prescription to the Royal Ontario Museum, who's quoted in the story. Again, we'll talk about that a little bit later in story safety, but that's the gold standard. You want the person that's being impacted by the innovation to be in the story, if possible, wherever possible. And then we had Dr. Kate Mulligan as sort of a voice closer to the end of this story, but who was offering that kind of that key message voice I was talking about a couple of slides ago, who was really driving home the possibility of this innovation at the systems level if it was scaled up. Then we had a primary complication of the isolated refugee suffering from PTSD, who had been taking a number of medications. We really love that being in the story because it proved it was like there's limitations here to physical medicine, limitations to what pharmaceuticals can do. So next slide, please. So then we had some of the secondary complications, this person being in a stressful environment, surrounded by what's going on in other people's lives, the amount of stress. Uh, the climax here was that offered all of these medications hadn't made any difference, but then through this intervention, social prescribing, she was making friends and was now volunteering. So our climax is in fact that moment where social prescribing uh, overcomes the difficulty, overcomes the barrier. And then what's made possible isn't just that this person is not isolated anymore, is connected better, but in fact, what's made possible is that she's making more connections and she's become part of the ecosystem that's now feeding back into social prescribing because she's now a volunteer. So imagine that is like the perfect climax, kind of. And it wasn't something we were envisioning. It was just that in this instance, the journalist happened to find an ideal client. The action, of course, we're talking here about like the what's actually being done. This is our opportunity to talk about how this goes wider than this intervention, just this particular partnership with the Royal Ontario Museum, and then the scale of people being helped. So 5,000 people and families, that are aiming to be helped by this. And then, of course, like I said, the coda, the moral at the end, in the voice of our expert, our in-house expert. At that point, there weren't a lot of people talking about social prescribing outside of our organization. At this point, we might go external with an expert if we were in a similar situation, because it's always, again, better to have an external expert talking about your story versus talking about it yourself. But in this case, having Kate there at the end of the story made a lot, having Dr. Mulligan at the end of the story there made a lot of sense. It was the voice of kind of authority. It was saying like, listen, if we do more of this, we'll end up with more great results at a system level. So that's kind of an example of a story structure, how it can play out in a best case scenario. In that case, it was a press release, and we'll get into why we use that format frequently in a little bit. But that was a best case example. Next slide, please. Okay, gathering materials for your story. Okay, now the best way to think about this is we've done a lot of theory up till now. I've presented story structure and presented an example of story structure and how it can play out in the real world. Now we're really getting into kind of, okay, if you got a handle on story structure, if you've got a handle on your goals and your audiences, maybe you even have some key messages kind of in the back of your mind that in an ideal world would end up in your story. Now it's time to really, you want to bake this cake. It's time to start gathering the ingredients. And so this is the step 3 really is about gathering those ingredients together, knowing what you need to have before you can kind of get started. And then, of course, getting started. So next slide, please. All right. So I want to impress here because when I got to this section, I thought, well, this should be Jason's definitive guide to planning to tell your story. Except that's just it. I'm here to tell you there is no definitive guide to how you should tell your story. And it is a distinctly personal thing how stories get told, even within a culture. Storytellers within a culture could have vastly different techniques, vastly different ways of emphasizing things within stories. And so it really is important to come up with your own system. So having said that, a general guide for how to get through this process will help you because it's going to give you steps along the way for knowing whether or not you have addressed the things that you need to address. So if you don't know who your characters are, for instance, at the beginning of a storytelling process, you're going to have a hard time. It doesn't mean you can't get started, though. There's been many of the times where I'll start planning a story, planning to tell a story. And in fact, I'm doing a few like this just this month. You won't know who you're going to interview yet. And that's normal. But in the back of your mind, even if you don't have specific people and phone numbers or email addresses, like, okay, these are the people I'm going to be telling, you should have a general sense of the role of that person or the character that's in the story. So even if you don't have a specific person in advance, you know, you got to have your characters kind of laid out. You're like, okay, who are the actors in this story? Who's going to be doing the action? And that is important to know in advance. You know, your guide will also be a way to tell where you need to take more time with story safety and development. And we'll get into story safety in a minute, but if you know you're going to be interviewing a client, for instance, or you know you're going to be working with a volunteer who's unpaid, you're going to have to take some extra steps there to make sure that person's safe, to make sure that that person is feeling like their story has space to breathe and that you're not rushing. You're not rushing a 5 minute interview with a client at the end of the day just because you need that client voice in there. That wouldn't be safely telling that story. So if you know in advance, oh, yeah, we really need to have a client voice in here, really need a volunteer's voice in here, you know you're going to need some extra steps, extra time for story safety. So that's why it's important to have a storytelling plan. And that's why I'm suggesting come up with a guide, come up with a plan, because it's important to have one. That draft, that plan, once you start filling out like, okay, here's my characters, here's who the settings are, and, probably doing this in point form. It doesn't have to be. That's how I do it. I often do it in point form. Once you have that kind of draft laid out in point form, your story is going to kind of, I'm sure you've all heard this before, write itself. And of course, it doesn't write itself. You still have to sit down and write it, and you still have to have some writing aptitude to be able to do that. But if you have the elements together, it is going to make sense where you need the story to go. And if there's a missing element, you're going to see it more clearly if you're using this kind of method. If you're not just sitting down and going, okay, I'm going to write the story from scratch now. If you've got a list in point form of the different elements that I just broke down from the structure, you're going to feel a lot more comfortable and confident. And if you don't feel comfortable and confident, you're going to go, okay, we're missing a piece here. I better go out and figure out what that piece is going to look like before I try to sit down and draft this. And the last thing here I say is pay attention to overall story strategy, not just one-by-one stories and placements. And the reason for that is simply that your goals are going to change over time, ideally. So if you're achieving your overall goals, again, to double back to the social prescribing example, our initial goals were awareness, but they didn't stay there because we achieved a certain level of awareness. Now, it's not to say we still don't tell stories that with the goal being awareness, because there's still plenty of people within Canada who don't know what social prescribing is. But our goals did evolve over time. They angled more towards demonstrating the effectiveness of social prescribing through some of the early evidence we were producing. So you can see your communications goals will evolve over time. It is important then at the beginning, when you're thinking about story strategy, to think about that and to think, okay, what types of stories or audiences would we go after right now? How might that change over time? And how might our early stories form a foundation for what will come later? Next slide, please. Okay, so although I'm not giving you a guide, because like I said before, I really think it's best if people come up with their own guide or their own point form note structure for how they're going to do their storytelling process. These are some questions that I would offer are important questions for anyone to ask when they're sitting down thinking about story planning and making a guide for how they're going to tell a story. So what's the setting for the story? And this could mean, it could mean something, the macro setting. It could be the name of the town or the city. It could be the neighborhood. It could be it's these 6 or 7 homes of these clients. These are the settings. It could be like as micro or as macro as that. It could be maybe the story for your setting is the entire province that you're working in. But the important thing is to think about it. What do you want the setting overall? What do you want the audience to see the setting as being for this story? If it's the whole town, I often see some organizations that will use drone footage these days. Either they'll find someone that they can borrow drone footage from, or maybe they know someone with a drone that can capture some footage quickly. That way you get this overarching kind of view of the whole town or the city. Maybe the context for the story or the setting is some demographics. Maybe you're talking about a specific community or population. So yeah, I want to think about like how would you represent that? If it's a written story, maybe it's with some key statistics about that population. If it's a visual story or a video story, maybe you're presenting some data, or maybe you're having someone from that community talk about their community so that you get that person's voice directly. The point is you want to think about setting so that you can think about how you would represent it. So the important thing is what is the setting here? And then later on when you're really getting into storytelling is when you're going to think, okay, I know what my setting is, I know what it needs to be and what I want it to look like. How will I represent that? What's the timeline look like? So again, how much time am I looking to convey has passed over the course of this story? Is it going to be a week, half a month, a year, 10 years? That's important because that's going to be the context in which you're laying out there's this problem, there's this solution, and here's what's happened. So, if you're telling a good news story about your solution, but it took 20 years for the solution to work, that might not come across to your audience as being a good news story. So you want to think about your timeline. You want to think about how you're presenting that and the passage of time and how you're going to convey that overall. What format might the work best take? Video, written. We did a whole session recently about this, and the point is I can talk for an hour just about this one small question. Again, you won't know this at the beginning, but it's important for you to be jotting down your details, your characters, who they are, your setting, what it is, your messages, what they are, your audience, where they might find your story. That's going to tell you what is the best format. The other thing, of course, being your resources. If you don't have a ton of resources, going out to hire a video team to do a video for you probably isn't going to be in the cards. But it is important to think about format beyond just resources. A lot of nonprofits, especially in healthcare and social services, will only think about story format based on, okay, well, we've got resources to do this, so we'll do this. Okay, we've got a video team over here, volunteers, so we'll do a video right now. And I think that's great. That's called story opportunism, and I highly encourage that. But the thing that I would offer as a caveat there is that's not the only thing you want to think about when you're thinking about format. You do want to think about audience. You want to think about, okay, is my audience going to watch a 10-minute video? Or are they so busy that they'd have a hard time watching a 30-second video? Is my audience going to read the Toronto Star? Or are they only going to read these local papers? Are they only going to read the medical journal? Is my, is it worth going on talk radio? Or are our decision makers, our audience only going to listen to CBC radio? These are the sorts of questions that's worth asking around format and audience, but also when you're thinking about format, it's worth thinking about your story materials too. So if you have some clients you really want to work with, but they're all camera shy, then don't do video. Rule the video out. Even if you have the resources to do it, think, okay, we'll put those resources on hold, put those resources to the side. We'll use them for something else. But if our clients don't want to, if they don't feel safe talking on a camera, we're not going to do that. So you want to really fit your format to your story materials and your audience while you're also thinking about resources. And so that's what I'll leave you with there. And then lastly, your checklist of key people. So your voices and the people from your community who will speak on the story, will speak in the story, who will support the story. But you also want to think about your production capacity here. So your writers, your video editors, your graphic designers that you might have around on your team or available to you as volunteers, etc. You want to think about your checklist and you want to have it written down for this specific story as you're making your guide. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so we talked about this a little bit already. I've alluded to it pretty much since the beginning. And, I know part of the DNA of Healthcare Excellence Canada is really, is patient safety, is client safety. It's doing healthcare better so that it's safer. And so that's why this section is vitally important. I think when people think about storytelling, they don't often think about safety. And what we want to tell you here is that it's really vitally important, particularly as health and social service providers, as health and social service planners, as advocates. that we first do no harm. I'm going to borrow that from the oath. It's very important that we first do no harm. It's better off if we don't tell a story if it's going to end up harming someone. So let's get into some practices around that. Next slide, please. Okay, so again, it's so important because who holds, tells, writes, shares a story holds its power. And for folks that have faced oppression, for anyone that's faced systemic abuse, uh, any sort of intergenerational trauma, stories can be fraught. And for anyone who feels like, well, stories never bugged me, or I've never felt that impacted by a story, chances are, number one, you have, and you don't remember, but chances are, number two, if you feel that way about story, it could be that you have a position of privilege where you've never been in a position where a story has, you know, knocked you down. But I'm here to tell you that it is important. It can knock people down, and especially these days when stories live on, uh, possibly forever online, it's of utmost importance that we're careful when we're telling people's stories. So, what makes an effective story for one group may not land with another. What you think is an important point may not be an important point for the person that you're interviewing or talking with. And that's why it's really important to be safe, to ask questions, to be curious when you're talking to someone for a story, when you're working with them, is to really surface their voice and make sure their voice is out in front. And again, I could give a whole workshop just about interviewing safely, but part of that is simply being humble. It's asking open-ended questions. It's letting people talk for longer, perhaps than you need them to talk, simply because uh, the interview itself, the process itself, is important. Not just the person collecting the story. It's not just important for the person packaging it together, the professional who has storyteller or media relations or comms person in their title. It's not just important for that person or for that audience or for that work. It's important for that person telling the story who doesn't have the agency that someone holding the technology or the apparatus of distribution. They don't have that kind of power. And so it really is up to you as a storyteller, as an interviewer, to level that playing field as much as possible, to really invite that person's voice in a real way. For cultures, as I say here, who face oppression, people can be cut off from their own storytelling traditions because of language barriers, because of trauma. Is something to keep in mind when you're approaching folks to ask them about their stories. Forcing Western storytelling traditions is another form of colonization. It's often an insidious one. I like to make adaptations for people to tell their stories to me in whatever way that is comfortable for them. So if someone doesn't feel comfortable talking to me on the phone, I'll find a way to do something over Zoom. If talking to me over Zoom or phone doesn't work, I'll try to find a way to see someone in person. If that's not possible, then I'll say to that person respectfully, I'd like to include your story, but it's not possible here because of these barriers. But let's try again another time. In other words, I won't just insist on my way of doing things because it's most convenient or what's most cost viable for me. That doesn't work. Safety again has to come first. As an activity, telling one's own story, very different from telling someone else's. Again, it almost sounds like common sense, but I put it there because people forget. I forget sometimes when I'm telling family member stories, for instance, and that's a good example. We've all had a family member where we've told their story or told their good news before they had a chance to tell it, and people get upset, right? And that's a good way of remembering that telling someone else's story is always different from telling your own. Even if you're part of an organization, telling an organizational story, you're telling others' stories, and so you really need to be cognizant of that as well. So, next slide, please. Safe story considerations. Okay, so first want to address that great graphic there on the left. When we're doing safe storytelling, we want to keep two things key in mind. anonymity and privacy, they're not the same thing. And this graphic illustrates it perfectly. So if someone asks me to tell their story anonymously, they're happy to have me share all of the personal details of their story as long as there's no details in the story that make it clear who they are. So no, no places or identifying details about their own personal characteristics that would to have the story come back to them, and certainly not their name, but they're okay with the detail, the granular nature of the story, the personal aspect of the story being out there. Privacy is almost like the opposite. The person is okay with their name being out there, they're okay with their identity being in the story, but they're being really clear about which parts of the story they're willing to share and which parts must remain private. So, in order to support both of those, consent is a process that has to be followed. And that should be an informed, ongoing, and a revocable process. And what that means is it's not about getting someone to sign a release before they do a video session with an interviewer and then going, okay, we have that on file now. And if that person comes back later and says, hey, that story that, the thing I said in that story, it really, it got out into the community and people are not talking to me anymore, or I lost friends, then you've done harm. And it was partly because you didn't check back in with the person with the final edit of that video to make sure that they felt safe with the comments as they were going to be in the final product. So what I mean by ongoing there is I mean that you need to check in with people repeatedly. You need to give them opportunities to pull their content if they see it necessary to pull their quote out, to pull what they've given you out of the story. And I know it's a difficult thing to do. It's a real leap of faith as a storyteller to go, okay, I did all this work to put the story together. It's together. I'm really happy with how it looks. I'm going to show it to these folks, but what if there's something in here they want to pull out, right? And it really takes courage in your own work. And that's what I would encourage. Be courageous with your own work. Make sure that folks have a chance to sign off on it throughout the process. So at the beginning, before you get going, and you've informed people about it, during, and then of course near the conclusion when you've got a final product, or even after that, if you put something up and 6 months later someone comes back to you and says, listen, I didn't realize how much impact this was going to have in my life, having that story out there. Could you take the story down? Then you're going to need to take the story down, even if you have a signed permission form or a release. So those are some of the things that I want you to keep in mind around story safety. It's something that you do differently depending on the different characteristics of a story. So it's never going to take the exact same steps every single time that you do it. It's going to depend on who you're dealing with, the nature of the story details, and then the nature of the external storytelling environment. So a lot of factors I couldn't possibly account for here. But the general things to keep in mind are here. Don't assume things. Always seek ongoing consent. And realistically, try to put yourself in someone's shoes. I think that that's a powerful way of looking at this, is bring empathy into your storytelling. If someone's telling a really difficult to tell story, I've cut people off and said, it's seeming really difficult for you to tell this right now. Are you sure you want to continue? Because we can do this on a different day. And I've had people take me up on that and say, you know what? I'm overwhelmed and thank you. And I've also had people say, you know what? No, I just need a minute. And, I've given them a box of tissues. They take a minute. And because it's their story, remember again, it could be difficult for them to tell it. But if they've told you, I know this is difficult. I know where you're showing the story. I know who it's going to get into the hands of. I'm okay with all of that and I still want to tell it. Then your responsibility is to help them tell it. Because just because a story is difficult, just because a story has vulnerability to it, doesn't mean it's a story you should leave behind. Those are more difficult stories to tell. Those are often the most impactful stories that will get you the most movement from policymakers. And so I encourage you, if a story seems difficult and it seems like it's going to be hard for a person, definitely check in with them, definitely give them additional support, but don't necessarily turn away from a more difficult to tell story. Next slide, please. Okay, yeah, some equitable approaches in storytelling. Not sure, are we showing a video here? Sorry, HEC team. It could be that we're not showing a video here. And it's okay if we're not, because I can talk about what you would see. In the social prescribing video, there's some older adults who had joined a bereavement group, who had joined a who had lost spouses. These folks are interviewed directly about their experiences. They're talking about their own personal lives, what they've gone through in terms of grief. So incredibly, incredibly personal. Um, there's a number of techniques that could be used here. One of the techniques used in video is frequently a mock-up. So if you have something that's really, really vulnerable and a person doesn't want to speak to it direct, sometimes what you can do is you can have a voiceover kind of talking about the story in general terms, and then you can just have a contextual shot, just a visual of that person speaking with a provider or some sort of, dramatization of an encounter like that. That gets away from, someone who has a difficulty telling their own story on camera, who might, break down in tears, but doesn't want to be shown breaking down in tears on camera, but still wants their story out there. So using a mock-up is one way to sort of get around that. The other thing I think is really important to remember here with this video is the people working with this group identified who was kind of enough past their grief and their trauma about losing their loved one and was ready to tell their story. So it's about, if you're going into a group of people, say 10 people, maybe not everybody there is at the same point in their lives. Maybe they just joined the bereavement group. Maybe they're only 4 or 5 months out from losing their spouse. Maybe that's not the person to talk to on camera then. And so part of your job as a storyteller is sort of identifying who's ready. And what I've found myself is that people will identify themselves when they're ready to tell stories. All you need to do is go be curious, ask open-ended questions, ask the group, like, tell me more about, how you came to be connected here. Tell me more about what difference this has had in your life. And the people who are ready to talk, they'll start talking to you. And once they're started to talk, that's when I'll break in at a juncture 10, 15 minutes in and say, hey, your story is really compelling. Thanks for telling me your story. Would you be interested in telling this story more widely? Because this can have an impact on other people's lives and on policy. And so people will kind of self-identify, particularly if you get, the gold standard here is you get to visit a group that you're thinking of doing a story about, and you can spend some time with the group. When you're not able to do that, I get it. It's not always possible. But these are good principles to keep in mind, even if you're just talking to someone over the phone. Be curious about their story, but don't off the top think, oh, I'm a journalist, I'm going to interview this person and get the details out of them to put into the story. That is how journalists do business. They have of course, a different set of tasks ahead of them than we do as storytellers. We want to keep people safe to begin with. I'm not saying journalists don't want to keep people safe. They do, but their bar is a little bit lower than ours. Our bar is higher. And so because our bar is higher, try to practice those techniques on the phone with someone around story safety. Try to see if they're open to telling their story. And if they're not, tell them, listen, if you're not ready to tell this story right now, I can tell there's some hesitancy you're having. I'm okay with us telling the story through another person's example right now. And if you're ready, when you're ready, we can double back with you. Or if the person pushes back and says, no, I'm ready to tell the story right now. You say, okay, I just wanted to check because the story is fairly recent. And I understand if you're feeling vulnerable around the story. So really giving a person options, which a journalist wouldn't normally do. A journalist is on deadline. They're going to go, okay, I got the quote. Good. Put it in. They're doing the basics to keep people safe, but not the kind of extra due diligence I'm suggesting here. In particular, I use the example here of working with people who were recently incarcerated, which I did last year on a project that we're working on at the Alliance. That was a really interesting one because I was getting active permission and active consent in the moment, but I was still concerned that folks weren't entirely cognizant of the impact that the resources that we were producing could have down the line. So I made notes to myself to check in with the person down the line and say, are you still okay with us holding this on video? Are you still okay with telling this story like this? Because, when you're talking about someone who was recently incarcerated, we go and tell the story. It's really important to tell the story because they're talking about how important the resources were to support them and their transition from incarceration in terms of supporting their healthcare and their well-being. But if we tell the story and then there's negative impact back on that person later, that negates any good that came from telling the story if it ends up negatively impacting that person later on. So taking extra precautions depending on the position of vulnerability, the position of marginalization, I should say, that someone is coming from is of utmost importance. And there are numerous ways to do it. So there's kind of, I want to say there's never an excuse to not do it, but next slide, please. I do have a slide for this too. What if you make a mistake? And you probably will. If you tell stories all the time, you're going to make mistakes because we, even if we're not journalists, are still working on deadlines. We're still trying to produce things for final reports, etc. Mistakes will be made. So if you do make a mistake, and I think it's less likely to make a mistake if you follow some of those practices I was mentioning in the 3 previous slides. But if you do make a mistake, just make sure you apologize, number one, and ask the person what needs to be done to make things right. Ask them what they see as the right resolution. Let them know that you take the breach seriously. Stay in touch. It's oftentimes what folks do wrong is they fall out of touch. They're very embarrassed at what had happened. Try to own up to it, and that means stay in touch until the person is satisfied with a resolution. Try to make the story details private. So if it's a story online, take it down. If it's in a newsletter, consider a retraction if the person is open to that. Debrief with your team and make sure it's clear like what needs to be done behind the scenes so that the mistake doesn't happen again, and then report that back to the person. Make sure that if there's any policies that need to be changed, that you're communicating that back to the person with whom you've made the mistake as well. That way they know there's action being taken and that they don't feel like they've made a complaint into a vacuum. And lastly, forgive yourself and move on. I like to keep a journal of these things so that I can have them for learning opportunities in the future when I'm talking to folks like yourself. But the truth is, you do need to forgive yourself. Mistakes do happen, and if you followed again, like if you followed an empathetic process and you've owned your mistake, then people should hopefully forgive you and recognize that storytelling, like any other human activity, is prone to mistakes, and we are all flawed. Okay, next slide, please. Drafting your story. Okay. So next slide. I know I said earlier that I wouldn't be giving a writing seminar during this session, and I really meant it. And that's why here, if you were expecting me to explain how to write the story, I'm not going to be doing that. Instead, what we're providing you here with is a story checklist. And I think this is a comprehensive checklist. If you've been sort of using your guide that you've personally put together, if you've considered your goals, your audiences, if you've dreamed about what kinds of story messages would connect to your strategic objectives. And then if you've unpacked your story structure and come up with a story guide and an ingredients list, you should have been able to put together a draft based on those materials. But here's the checklist. As you're putting together your draft, I want you to consider these things because I think these things are essential. Your hook or your lead. So we went into that earlier. Your hook or your lead. Social prescribing, it was, hey, imagine you could get a prescription for bingo, right? Do you have one? You need one. You really do need to have a compelling hook or a lead, even if you're talking about a really, really compelling piece of data. Are your characters well developed? Is the problem well articulated? Is it too overwhelming or too negative? I already touched on that. Does your story include human voices speaking to truths? If it doesn't, it's going to be harder for an audience of any kind, even a policy audience, to really, really, to remember it, first of all, but also to really see the impact. Did you take care with your human voices? So, as I just mentioned, story safety. Have you checked in with people along the way and gotten approval on final drafts, ongoing consent? Is there a resolution, or is there learning for the characters and the audience to go away with? And have you made those things clear in the following action? Do the reader and the audience come away with what the action point that's needed? Is it clear? What the audience, if they got your message, are they going to go do the thing? Are they going to advocate for doing the thing that you've talked about? Did you consider how the story looks visually? And of course, how are you going to get the story out there? And so that moves us to the next slide. Sharing your story. Now, if I seem a little rushed here at the end, it was I want you to know it was always by design, and that's partly because sharing your story was never meant to be the bulk of this presentation today. So I'm going to spend in about the next 7-8 minutes talking about sharing your story. I want you to know that there's a lot more to this. Uh, my full-time job is media relations, and and that encompasses a lot more than just dealing with the media. Obviously, on a the first level, you're dealing like on a primary level, I am writing emails to reporters and editors, but there's a lot more that goes into it. So we're gonna do like what I call the crash course in it here. But if you want to know more about this, I encourage you to look at resources online. I encourage you to talk to your communications teams. I encourage you to look at best practices around media relations this day and age. And I say this day and age because things are changing rapidly. And I know we're always saying that, but as somebody who worked in the media goes on 10 years ago now, things have changed again in the last 10 years, even more than they did in the previous 10 to that. And I would argue that things have changed just in the last 2 to 3 years, even more than that. But we'll get into some of that. So next slide, please. Okay, so I start here with a couple of examples from social prescribing's early days, earlier days, I should say. So the first example there on the left is the success story. Um, and this is very much focused on the local, what's being done locally. This was a knitting group, I believe, of folks that had come together. They're addressing things like postpartum depression with social connection. So really, this is the promise of social prescribing delivered through the story of a hyper local story based in Guelph, so situated at a specific place. This was a really important kind of demonstration of what's possible, the concept. And then on the right is our social prescribing final report from the pilot project. So social prescribing has gotten much bigger than that since, much bigger than the Alliance, and is now a national organization, the Canadian Institute for Social Prescribing. But back in 2020, when this report was released, again, a really important part of this work was to storytell in such a way that evidence, and such our evidence was very early evidence, it was a pilot project, so smaller data sets, et cetera. So taking that early evidence and really putting it adjacent right next to the hyper local, hyper specific stories from the impacts it was having on people's lives. And so really having those two things together, married together, the evidence and the story, to give a fulsome sense of here's how this works, here's what it's doing, but also in the person's direct voice, here's how it's impacting their life on a day-to-day basis. So it's not just that it's impacting health costs. It's not just that it's impacting less use of family physicians, for instance, which were some of the early findings. It's that it's having these subjective, substantive effects on people's lives. And so really having that in there mixed together. So it wasn't just like 5 pages of evidence and then 5 pages of story, but really having it kind of graphically designed so that it was next to each other to give that kind of impact of the evidence, in fact, being supported by the stories, and the stories being supported by the evidence, an ecosystem, if you will, of storytelling for healthcare. So I encourage you, when you do get these slides, to take a look at both those examples, especially the final report. Some of it was graphic design and being really specific and intentional about our decision making. When we did that, part of it was just the way that the program lead and Dr. Mulligan had conceived of how we were going to storytell around this intervention. So we weren't going to have groundbreaking data from a small pilot project that took place over a couple of years. But what we were gonna have was we were gonna have surfaced a bunch of really compelling stories and promise about what was possible with policy support, with funding support. So this is a really good example of kind of what you do early on when you're trying to gain support for an intervention. And you don't have, people are always saying, show me the data, show me the data, show me the data. Well, when you can't show fully the data yet, partly what you do is you show the promise from the data you do have and the stories that you do have. So I think those are both great examples for you to check out. Next slide. So your story in the world, media relations matters. It is about forming relationships with key journalists. Work with what you have right now, but recognize that it always makes sense to go and Google your intervention, your program, what you're doing in the health or social system, and figure out which reporters in your area, but also beyond that, in your region, in your province, which reporters and which outlets are covering that. So know who's covering your stories regularly and make relationships with them. That's really important. And remember too that when you're doing media relations, if you're sending out pitches, if you're sending out, um, press releases, those all count. You can, keep those as communications assets. If you're doing them well, if you're really laying out your story with all the elements, as I sort of described during earlier in this presentation, the press release itself is a story. And so it's useful. It's useful to have that. You can repurpose that later. Someone comes to you looking for a story. You're like, oh, I've got that. And so you may have started using it as a pitch for a media outlet and may end up in a newsletter or a final report later on. Next slide, please. Okay. These ones I'm going to sort of skip past. They're there for your reference, but I did sort of reference this already. That what sort of ended up happening was, we ended up with that ROM story, and then we ended up with a lot of copycats. And this is what I mean about story ecosystem. That story about the Royal Ontario Museum ended up on the front page of the Toronto Star. Or sorry, it ended up on the front page of the front page of the Toronto Star, but we also ended up with a front page story in the Globe and Mail. And this started to snowball after a while. And so what our goal then became, if you end up succeeding with your initial efforts, your goal then ends up becoming, okay, which media opportunities matter to us? Which ones do we want to choose to use? Which ones can we skip? And then how do we make the most of the ones that we're choosing to do? And sort of our goal around that became, okay, we're going to keep doing the hyper local stuff because we love the good news stories like I just showed you from Guelph, but we want to do more of these high level systems level things. And so we're also going to have a separate set of key messages. At this point, it made sense to sort of start separating things out and thinking like, okay, here's one set of key messages for the local audience. Here's what social prescribing is. Here's some examples of some fun sounding social prescriptions that you might want to write about in your local paper. And here's some testimonials from some people that have been doing this, either volunteers or link workers that have been doing the work or from clients themselves. But then for the health system audience, our messaging started to become much different. It started to become, listen, this is part of what's missing from our primary healthcare system. This is part of the reason why people are showing up at their doctor's office when they don't have healthy food in their fridge. So we started to make a systems level argument, but also started to make storytelling around that as well. And so the storytelling around that would look a lot different, right? Because at that point, the bad guy becomes less loneliness and social isolation, and it becomes an underfunded, disconnected healthcare system. And so you can see how the story has evolved. It's the same story, but we're looking at it from much different angles with much different messages, possibly with different characters. Why? Because we have different audiences and different goals. So again, getting back to the very beginning of this presentation, when your goals and your audiences are different, everything below that's going to look different too. You're not going to storytell in the same way if your goals and your audience's story are different. So next slide, please. This is a bit about pitching and placing and what matters in terms of pitching and placing. I'm not going to go into depth into this, but in terms of when you're considering how you pitch and things to consider when you're putting together your pitch, this is where to look. Next slide, please. And of course, knowing who you're going to pitch. Again, if you're doing the storytelling work from up above, you're going to know exactly who you're pitching. But as in from your organization, who you're pitching, who your roster of the second point here, who your roster of go-to experts is, and who your spokespeople are. But who you will pitch matters too. And that's why I was getting at, make sure you research who covers your area. Make sure you know who's on the beat for your innovation. Or if no one's on the beat, find the person that'd be most likely to do it. In our case, no one was writing about social prescribing in Canada, not surprisingly, because it didn't really exist. But there were lots of people writing about loneliness. There were lots of people writing about isolation. So those were our folks that we had to go to. Next slide, please. And of course, how you pitch matters. I always do personalized notes still to this day, even when I'm pitching somebody I know, even when it's a reporter I've had a relationship with for half a decade. They still get a personal note. If I know they have family, like I know they're on vacation recently, I'll say, "Hey, hope your vacation was fun." Because I'm trying to make sure they know I have a relationship with them, that I'm there to help them too, right? And again, that's thinking about what they need. That's what we're talking about here. So the media craves expert sources, authoritative, genuine voices, more than anything, too, at the local level. They crave your stories fully formed because they don't have journalists to report them. And that's the sad state of local journalism these days. I won't get into it, but it's an opportunity for you because it means you can be the journalist. If you present a good enough story locally, it's probably going to get printed verbatim. And that still happens to me regularly. Next slide, please. Here's a couple of examples of what's possible with a long form media game, a long media relations game. I talked about it, alluded to it. There's that healthy debate piece on social prescribing that comes up in 2020 after the final report, and that's with Dr. Kate Mulligan as the byline on there. But that was drafted. Only later could we do that kind of storytelling, right? Where we were really getting into the health system impact of social prescribing once there was some evidence out there. But the social prescribing storytelling ecosystem up to that point is what allowed that story to happen. It's what supports that story to happen, is that there's a general awareness, if there's an ecosystem of things already out there telling people what this thing is. And then I love the second example there. That's the last thing I'm going to tell you about in terms of my own successes. And this was a real accident, but 7 years, I think, after the fact of me sending, or 6 years after the fact of me sending that 2018 press release, I got an inquiry from a CBC journalist saying, "Hey, I saw this press release from you, and we'd really like to do a story about community health centers." And I said, "What press release?" And then she showed me the 2018 press release, and I thought, wow, now that's a long game. Now, that doesn't usually happen, but it shows the value of telling your story, even if you don't get the response right away. Telling your story, getting it out there, publishing the press releases, sending them to journalists. You don't know when the impact is going to come, but sometimes it comes much later. Next slide, please. Okay, some things that you can use your story pitch for later. I already sort of went through some of those, but those are some of the uses once you get a story down in written form. Those are some of the things you can do with it. Okay, next slide, please. Next slide. Tell the
Jason,
story. Yeah.
I'm wondering if we can just
Yeah.
move to the power of storytelling as a nice way of bringing this to a close. The engagement has been amazing. There's thank yous galore in the chat.
Thank you.
Folks saying that they've been engaged this entire time, and we've reiterated to everybody that the slides will be shared, the video will be shared, and so just want to give you the last word here before I invite folks to register for our next session.
Thanks. I mean, we're on the right slide. The last words in the power story. You're all storytellers. Thank you again for joining me for such a long session today. It's in all of you to tell great stories. I'm going to leave you with something I didn't think would be my final message today, but because I'm talking and I saw how many people are here from so many different parts of the country, it's really vital for us right now to tell our stories, our stories. And that means the stories in your communities. And that means taking those extra steps for those folks that are vulnerable, marginalized, to get their voices out there. Our stories matter, they're unique, and they're the best ways to prove your solutions. I know the data matters. I know that getting scaled up, it's all about the data. It's all about proving the model of the concept with the data. But the stories are, I firmly believe, what gets something from a policy idea that looks good in terms of on paper and is supported by the data and gets a cabinet voting for it, is that it's made a difference in people's lives. And so your storytelling on these local levels, it may not always seem like it matters around the cabinet table, but I'm here to tell you it does. I wish you well in your storytelling, and please be in touch if you'd like to talk more.